I never imagined that a rusted iron gate at the end of a gravel road would become the center of the biggest fight our little lakeside community had ever seen. Looking back now, people like to say it was about property lines, HOA rules, or old legal documents, but they're wrong. It started because one person believed that having authority meant she could decide what everyone else deserved, and I happened to be the first person who stopped saying yes. My name is Jack Holloway. I'm 56 years old, a retired bridge inspector from northern Wisconsin, and if you'd asked me 2 years ago what mattered most in life, I would have told you peace and quiet without even thinking about it. Funny how life teaches you that peace isn't something you find. Sometimes it's something you have to fight for. My cabin sits on the edge of Clearwater Lake, about 20 miles outside of town. Most people only drive through on their way somewhere else. It's nothing fancy. Cedar siding that's faded from years of snow, a wraparound porch I built with my brother before he moved west, an old cast-iron stove inside that still pops every winter when the temperature drops below zero. My wife, Maggie, used to say the place smelled like coffee, pine needles, and old books. She loved that smell. She claimed it made every bad day feel smaller the minute she walked through the front door. Cancer doesn't care how peaceful your life is. By the spring of last year, Maggie had been gone for almost 16 months. Some mornings I'd still catch myself pouring 2 cups of coffee before realizing what I was doing. Grief is strange that way. It doesn't hit you all at once forever. It sneaks up on you while you're doing ordinary things, then disappears before anyone else notices. So I kept busy. Every morning, I'd walk the trail behind my cabin down to the old service gate near the shoreline. The gate had been there longer than I had. Rust covered the hinges. Vines climbed halfway up the posts every summer, and most people barely noticed it anymore. I checked the lock, cleared away branches after storms, and oiled the hinges whenever they started groaning too loudly. Nobody asked me to do it. I just did. The funny thing was, half the neighborhood depended on that little road behind the gate, even if they never thought about it. Delivery trucks used it during bad weather, utility crews used it after heavy storms, and the volunteer fire department had listed it as an emergency access route for years. It wasn't glamorous work keeping it usable, but somebody had to care about things that only became important when everything else went wrong. That was the difference between people like me and people like Vanessa Cole. Vanessa moved into the subdivision after selling a luxury real estate company in Minneapolis. Within a year, she'd become president of the Homeowners Association. She had perfect white jackets, perfectly rehearsed smiles, and a habit of speaking to grown adults like elementary school students who forgot to color inside the lines. At first, I ignored her. Honestly, I figured she'd get bored eventually. Instead, she got ambitious. One month, she banned basketball hoops that faced the street because they looked cluttered. The next month, she fined a retired couple because their vegetable garden wasn't considered visually consistent with neighborhood standards. I watched people complain quietly over coffee at the diner, then nod politely whenever Vanessa walked into the room. Nobody wanted to fight, especially not me. The first time she came to my porch, she carried a leather folder tucked under one arm like it was part of her uniform. "Mr. Holloway," she said with that practiced smile, "we've received several concerns regarding your maintenance activities around the service road." I looked past her toward the lake before answering. "My maintenance activities?" "Yes. The association believes those responsibilities should now be coordinated through the board." I laughed before I could stop myself. "You planning on oiling rusty hinges now?" Her smile didn't disappear, but it definitely got tighter. "This community has evolved." I nodded slowly. "No," I said. "The houses got bigger. That's not the same thing." For just a second, I caught something in her eyes. Not anger exactly. More like surprise that someone hadn't immediately folded. From that day forward, little things started happening. Letters appeared in my mailbox. Friendly reminders. Policy updates. Inspection notices. Nothing serious enough to challenge in court, but enough to remind me that someone was watching. My neighbor Earl noticed it before I did. He leaned against my truck one afternoon after we'd finished hauling firewood and said, "Jack, she's trying to wear you down." I shrugged. "Then she's wasting her time." Earl chuckled. "No," he said quietly. "She's waiting for you to get tired before she asks for something that actually matters." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Turns out he understood people a whole lot better than I did. Because 3 weeks later, Vanessa's contractors showed up without warning. And by sunset, something Maggie had spent nearly 20 years protecting was gone. If you think that's where this story reaches its breaking point, trust me, we haven't even gotten to the part where an entire neighborhood discovers just how dangerous it can be to underestimate the quiet guy at the end of the road. The contractors arrived just after 8 on a Thursday morning while I was replacing a loose board on the dock. I remember hearing the backup alarm from a flatbed truck before I ever saw it. At first, I figured somebody was delivering landscaping supplies to one of the newer homes farther up the hill. Then I noticed 2 men in bright yellow safety vests walking through my side yard like they owned the place. I climbed off the ladder and called out, "Morning, fellas. You boys lost." One of them looked almost embarrassed. He pulled a folded work order from his pocket and said, "We're here for the gate." I frowned. "What gate?" He pointed toward the old iron entrance at the end of the service road. Association ordered a full removal. For a second, I honestly thought it had to be some kind of mistake. Nobody called me. The younger guy shifted his weight and shrugged. "Sir, we just follow the paperwork." By the time I reached the road, they already had a cutting torch fired up. Sparks were bouncing across the gravel while the old hinges, the same hinges I'd oiled for years, glowed bright orange. I waved them down. "Hold up. Who signed off on this?" One of them handed me a clipboard. Right there at the bottom was Vanessa Cole's signature. Under the reason for removal it read, "Obsolete structure creating visual inconsistency and limiting future community improvements." Visual inconsistency. I stared at those words longer than I probably should have. That gate had been standing there for over 40 years. Volunteer firefighters had driven through it. Utility crews had used it after ice storms. Kids had ridden their bikes through it every summer. And now somebody had reduced all of that to 2 words on a piece of paper. I drove straight to the association office. Vanessa was sitting behind a polished conference table with 3 board members beside her, each one suddenly fascinated by the papers in front of them. She smiled when I walked in. "Jack, I wasn't expecting you." "I bet you weren't." I placed the work order on the table. "You had no right." She folded her hands together calmly. "The board voted unanimously." "I didn't ask what the board did." "The access road is being modernized." "For who?" "For the future of the community." I leaned forward. "That gate wasn't decoration." She tilted her head just enough to make it clear she thought she was explaining something obvious. "People don't use it anymore." "You mean you don't?" Silence filled the room. Finally, one of the older board members cleared his throat. "Jack, maybe it's time for some updates." I looked around the table. Every single one of them avoided eye contact. That told me everything. They weren't making decisions anymore. They were following Vanessa. By sunset, the gate was gone. Not stored. Not preserved. Cut into pieces and hauled away as scrap metal. I walked down to the empty opening just before dark. The tire marks were still fresh in the dirt. Maggie used to stop there whenever we came home from town. She'd reach out the truck window, push the gate open herself, and joke that hearing those rusty hinges squeak meant we were finally away from everybody else's problems. Funny the things your heart decides are important after someone is gone. Earl came over with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Neither of us talked much. He finally looked toward the empty entrance and said, "Feels wrong, doesn't it?" "Yeah." "You gonna let it go?" I didn't answer. Mostly because I didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I wandered into the storage room beneath the cabin looking for an old photo album. Maggie had always been the organized one, every folder labeled in neat handwriting, every receipt tucked into envelopes by year. Instead of finding photographs, I found a dusty metal toolbox. Inside were survey maps, maintenance logs, handwritten notes from the original developer, and an aging binder labeled emergency access records. I carried everything upstairs. By 1 in the morning, my dining table was completely covered. At first, it looked like nothing more than boring paperwork. Then one sentence caught my attention. "Permanent emergency corridor. Maintenance responsibility assigned through the Holloway parcel under original development agreement, pending future municipal transfer." I read it again, then a 3rd time. The more pages I turned, the stranger everything became. Apparently, decades earlier, before the subdivision expanded, the county refused to approve the neighborhood unless there was guaranteed emergency access from the lakeshore to the main highway during floods and heavy snow. The original owner of my property had agreed to dedicate that narrow gravel road for emergency use while keeping ownership of the land itself. The county had intended to assume responsibility later. It never happened. Somehow the paperwork simply stopped. No transfer. No updated agreement. No permanent association ownership. Nothing. The road everyone treated like common property still legally crossed private land. Mine. The next morning I drove into town to see Owen Mercer. Owen had been practicing real estate law longer than most attorneys stayed alive. His office smelled like old wood, coffee, and legal books that probably hadn't moved in 20 years. He adjusted his glasses while flipping through the documents. After about 10 quiet minutes, he looked over the top of the folder. "Jack, where exactly did you get these?" "My basement. I hope nobody else knows you have them." "Why?" He leaned back slowly. "Because your homeowners association appears to have demolished an improvement sitting on property they don't own." I blinked. "They what?" "They may have destroyed private property without authorization." The room suddenly felt a whole lot quieter. Owen kept reading. "The road is even more interesting." "What about it?" "If this agreement is still enforceable, they don't have operational authority over the emergency corridor." I frowned. "So who does?" He closed the binder. "You." I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it sounded impossible. "I just oil hinges." "No," Owen said. "You've been maintaining legally significant infrastructure for years without realizing it." Over the next several days, he dug through county archives while I stayed quiet. Every afternoon, he'd call with another piece of the puzzle. No updated easement. No transfer agreement. No maintenance contract. No liability insurance naming the association. Every assumption Vanessa had built her authority on rested on paperwork that had never actually been completed. By the following Tuesday, Owen walked into my cabin carrying a thick envelope. "I've drafted something." "What is it?" "A formal notice." I skimmed the first page. "Effective immediately, all non-emergency access across the Holloway corridor was suspended pending legal clarification regarding ownership, liability, and unauthorized destruction of private improvements." I looked up. "You really think this will get her attention?" Owen smiled for the first time all week. "I think she spent years believing nobody would ever read the original documents." Late that afternoon, certified letters went out to every board member. Then I waited. I wish I could tell you I had some elaborate plan after that. Truth is, I didn't. I only wanted someone to admit they'd crossed a line. Instead, just before sunset on Friday, I heard tires crunching across my driveway. Vanessa stepped out of a black SUV carrying my legal notice in one hand. And the look on her face told me this fight had just become something neither one of us could walk away from. Vanessa didn't bother with her usual smile. She walked up onto my porch holding the certified letter between two fingers like it had personally offended her. "Tell me this is some kind of joke," she said. I leaned back in my chair and nodded toward the empty seat across from me. "If you're here to talk, sit down. If you're here to argue, you're wasting a trip." She stayed standing. "You cannot close that access road." "According to my attorney," I replied. "I already did." Her jaw tightened. "That road belongs to this community." "Then you should have checked before tearing down something that didn't." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The breeze coming off the lake rattled the maple leaves overhead, and somewhere down the shoreline a dog barked. Finally, she took a slow breath and lowered her voice. "Jack, you're creating unnecessary problems for everyone." I looked at the empty space where the old gate used to stand. "No, I'm asking everyone to deal with a problem you created." She stared at me another second before turning around and walking back to her SUV. As she pulled away, I had a feeling that conversation wasn't really over. It was only the beginning. The following weekend brought the first heavy storm of the season. Rain poured for nearly 12 straight hours. Water collected along the lower roads, and by Sunday morning the county temporarily closed the main entrance into the subdivision because part of the pavement had washed out. Normally, emergency vehicles would have been routed through the old service corridor behind my cabin. Except now there wasn't a gate anymore, and there wasn't any legal authorization for regular traffic to cross my land. By noon, the sheriff's office called. The deputy who spoke with me couldn't have been more respectful. "Mr. Holloway, we're trying to understand the ownership situation." "So am I," I answered. Within hours, county engineers, emergency management officials, and attorneys were reviewing documents that apparently nobody had looked at in decades. What started as an HOA dispute had suddenly become a county issue. That changed everything. The board held an emergency meeting on Tuesday night. For the first time in years, the community clubhouse was completely full. People weren't there to complain about flower beds or mailbox colors. They wanted answers. Earl called me afterward. "You should have seen it," he laughed. Vanessa spent 20 minutes blaming old paperwork. Then somebody asked why they demolished private property without confirming ownership. How'd that go? About as well as you'd expect. The room had gone silent. One by one, homeowners started asking questions nobody on the board could answer. Who approved the demolition? Who verified the surveys? Who accepted the legal risk? Who was paying for all this? Authority sounds impressive right up until someone asks for accountability. 2 days later, my phone rang again. This time it was Owen. They want to settle. They finally figured out they're cornered? I'd say reality finally caught up. The meeting took place Friday afternoon inside the county administration building instead of the HOA clubhouse. That alone told me how serious things had become. Around one long conference table sat county officials, attorneys, board members, and Vanessa, who looked more tired than angry now. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody pounded the table. Real consequences rarely need shouting. Owen slid a folder toward the board. The proposal is straightforward, he said. First, reimbursement for the unauthorized demolition of Mr. Holloway's gate and restoration of the historic entrance using materials approved by both parties. Second, formal recognition of the property's ownership boundaries. Third, a recorded legal agreement granting limited emergency access while assigning all maintenance costs to the association. Fourth, mandatory legal review before any future enforcement action involving privately owned infrastructure. The board members quietly read every page. One of them looked toward Vanessa. She never looked back. After several minutes, she spoke for the first time. We accept. There wasn't any applause. No dramatic celebration. Just signatures. Sometimes that's what justice looks like. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Just people finally being forced to accept responsibility for decisions they thought they'd never have to explain. Construction crews returned 3 weeks later. This time they knocked on my door before unloading a single tool. Together we picked a design that looked almost identical to the original gate. Right down to the curved ironwork Maggie used to run her hand across whenever we came home. The only difference was a small bronze plaque mounted on one of the stone posts. Emergency access corridor. Protected by recorded agreement. It wasn't flashy. Most people driving through probably never noticed it. I did. A month later, Earl stopped by with 2 fishing poles and a cooler. He looked at the rebuilt gate, smiled, and said, "You know, the funny thing is, this was never really about a gate." "No," I answered. "It was about respect." I nodded. "Always was. These days the neighborhood is quieter. The HOA still exists, but people ask more questions before they vote. Board members read documents instead of assumptions. And every now and then someone new moves into the subdivision, notices the old iron gate at the end of the road, and asks why everybody seems strangely protective of it. I usually just smile. Some stories don't need to be told twice. But this one, maybe it does. Because every community has someone who mistakes authority for ownership, and every once in a while they run into someone who quietly remembers that those aren't the same thing. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I overreact by forcing the issue through the law instead of simply letting it go? Or was standing my ground the only way to stop a pattern that would have kept hurting people? Let me know down in the comments. I'd really like to hear where you draw the line between protecting your rights and escalating a neighborhood conflict. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a difficult neighbor, or someone who thought power meant they never had to answer for their choices, share your story too. Sometimes the best conversations start with the smallest piece of unfinished business.